Hello everybody, welcome to Build or Buy. Today we're going to be looking at upgrading a power supply. Now, this is Andrew's old computer, and this is more about getting this thing running because Andrew's still going to build a new one. But what we're going to be upgrading, we're looking at an HP Pavilion P6000. And this is a model number P6531P. That's an HP Pavilion P6000 P6531P. Nice computer back in its day. The problem Andrew is having is sometimes it'll come on, sometimes it won't. So the decision is it the motherboard or is it the power supply? And we are of the opinion at Build or Buy that this is the power supply. Now we can test this theory by hooking up a voltmeter to the power supply and see where voltage is at. But based on experience and longevity and determination of the age of this computer, we think it's the power supply. So that's where we're going to go. And stick with us and we'll see how this works. So the power supply that was in here, first of all, the way this case is designed, the way it comes open, this was what we call the BTX format. So the BTX means the opening is on the opposite side that we're used to. We've got one screw to take off and pull the lid. And the power supply we were looking at was to get of the same size that was in here. This was about a 350 watt power supply. Now, we could have put a 350 watt power supply in here, but we're going to go overkill and we're going to put in a bigger power supply. To have purchased this same power supply of this wattage and this brand would have cost more. So we're putting in a bigger power supply for less. Bang for the buck. So this was a Bestec 350 watt. Now there's a clip in the back that you can't see that is the only thing that we may not be able to fit, but as far as the length, width, and height and depth, we should be good to go. It's not fully modular, but neither is this power supply. And all we want to do is get this thing up and going. Now the power supply we purchased, good old Amazon. I tell you, when you can get it in 2 days, that's the way to go. So we're going to get this out, see what we've got. We're going to all see here for the first time. Amazon's really good with packaging sometimes, but not always. This is pretty good packaging. Now the power supply we chose is an EVGA. This is an EVGA 500 watt. 500 watt power supply with a 3-year warranty. So I'm going to get this box out of the way. Let's get this thing open and see what we've got. You know, it's funny, used to a lot of the equipment we buy, it was sealed. Power supply is about the only thing now that has a factory seal on them. Motherboards don't have it on them. Hard drives still do. Motherboards and video cards do not. Even the RAM maybe have a factory seal on it. So I'm going to open this power supply up. Got my trusty razor knife with me. Usually nothing sharper than a crayon. And we're going to see what we've got here with the cables. I like to be fairly neat when I get a power supply out because there is the remote chance it might have to go back. The power supplies we were using for several years were the OCZ, and 5-year power supplies, oddly enough, I've already replaced 3 OCZ power supplies. And we were using OCZ products extensively 5 years ago. OCZ memory, DDR2, OCZ power supplies. And remember OCZ, they purchased PC Power and Cooling. That was my favorite power supply. We go to Comdex. Always wanted to look those guys up. But now we're using EVGA. In our new machines, EVGA. Now in the new machines we're using an EVGA G3, either a 750 or an 850. And again, this is an EVGA 500 watt. Bigger than what was in here. But this power supply costs $10 less. Whenever you're shopping with a power supply, you always want to check your dimensions. But you always want to not just shop for the size, but compare. And even though we have some components listed for our spec sheet on Build or Buy, we don't generally put a list to a vendor anymore because things change. So we have a spec sheet you can take a look at for building a new machine, and you can compare that. And you can Google that. So we get a new cable for power. and we get a power supply. And there may be, the wiring harness is attached, there may be a set of screws in here, and there are not. Yes, there are. Taped to the lid. So we got a set of 4 screws, and I will set those aside. 4 black screws. On the more expensive power supplies, we always recommend using a modular, fully modular, but we're going to see if this is going to fit the way we want it to. So what we're going to do is the first thing, we need to hook this up and see if it powers up, just for a comparison before we put in the new one. The reason for that is you want to find out if anything else is going on. So what we're going to do is hook it up just as if we were going to power it up. We've got a monitor set up, and we're going to check it for what we're going to be required. We need power, and I'm going to go ahead and put in a keyboard and mouse. That'll be USB. I'm looking at the video. This particular computer can do VGA or DVI. There is no HDMI, no display port. So with this monitor, it's a ViewSonic, and this is a ViewSonic VX2252MH. That's a 22-inch monitor. And that is the smallest I could get and still get a 1080 resolution. But that monitor gives us the analog and digital connections we need. And I've already gone ahead and hooked up the DVI cable. So we're going to get out the power cable that comes with the new power supply. And we're going to use this to test the old power supply. Again, I'm not hooking up a voltmeter. It's a great idea to do, but if you don't have one, don't spend the money. The reason being on this is we have 2 options to replace, the motherboard or the power supply. The motherboard would not be replaceable. To replace this in a BTX, they don't make them anymore. And if we bought one specifically for this HP computer, it'd cost an arm and a leg. It'd be cheaper to buy a new computer. So the only thing that's reasonable to replace is that power supply. So we don't lose anything because we could always use that power supply on another computer. But all we want to do is get this thing up and running. And if this works, I'll be surprised. But I have had it turn on for me before. But I just want to see it again. So I'm going to plug in. I've got a power tap. Power tap's plugged into a UPS. I plugged in the computer to power. I plugged in the monitor to power. Now I'm going to plug in the DVI for video. Get the correct orientation. Okay, I'll turn on my power tap. So I've got power, I've got a green light. And on the back of this computer, you see the monitors coming up. The back of this computer, this particular power supply has an LED. So I know there's power coming to this. So now sorry about that. We'll hit the power button on the front. I'm going to spin this around. That's why I'm on the ground doing this, because it doesn't have far to fall. Put the power button to it. No keyboard, no mouse, so we should get a beep error. But we should see something on screen. It's powering up. Now, beforehand, we've got an LED on the motherboard. We could get power to this, and everything you've seen we'd see, and it would look like it was running, but the system would never boot. With no keyboard and mouse, we should get an error code. What I'm listening for is the hard drive. I can hear the hard drive running, but I'm not getting anything on the screen. So I don't think we're getting enough power to the motherboard. Now we can wait and see if this is going to boot. It is a slow to boot computer. We ran a Belarc report on this. I know when this computer was built. When we get it up and running, I'll show you that report. I also know when Windows was upgraded to Windows 10. Andrew got his money's worth out of this computer. I wish I could get a computer that lasted this long. But it's getting a little long in the tooth. Andrew's probably going to be building a Ryzen computer. But what we want to do is get this one up and running. I'm watching the lights on the front, and the system shows me that it's coming up. The hard drive is spinning. I should have had an error by not having the keyboard and mouse plugged in, but it didn't give me an error. But it's still trying to boot. So we're going to give it a minute. And some of the process when I'm installing the power supply will try and speed up. While that's working, let's work on this power supply. I'm going to undo this group of cables, and I'm going to take a look at what I've got here in my snake. I have a main power supply that should be a 20 or 24 pin. And as I look at the wiring harness here on this snake, yep, 20 plus 4. Why do they still do that? For some of the older computers. There's my 20 plus 4, 24 pin. We'll see what it requires. This CPU, being the age it is probably going to require a 4 pin for power for the additional. And I'm looking at the motherboard right now, and it looks like, yep, a 4 pin. So what I'm looking for is one of these power taps that will go to the motherboard for that additional 4 pin. Here we are. So I'm going to put this over to one side, and I've got 2 4 pins together that would make an 8 pin on a new board. And on the new systems you'll be using, that's another reason for a larger power supply on a new machine. Some have 1 tap that goes for the CPU, some have 2 taps, and some, like the MSI X370, have 3 taps. The third tap is to supply power to the PCI Express if you're going to do a couple of video cards. We're never going there with this like that. So we've got what we need to do power to this computer. So there's my main power tap. There's my secondary to the CPU. Now I'm going to check my connectors. I'll have 2 types. I'll have the Molex, which is the old style, and I have the new style that goes to the SATA devices. So there's one for SATA. There's a Molex. And I've got 2 others here. It should be for PCI, one of them. Yeah, one of them is for PCI Express, and it's actually wide. So I've got an 8 pin, actually a 6 with a 2 gives me 8, and on this other side 6 plus a 2 gives me 8. That all comes off the same lead. That would be for a video card that would require it. Video on this is built onto the motherboard. And here's our other SATA. So we have 2 SATA, and we have 1 with a Molex. Each can hold 3 devices. So we'll have everything we need to hook this up. So I don't see this machine coming up, but of course the drive is still spinning. So it's booting. That's just how old this is and how slow it is. This is terrible. You know, it's interesting in this day when we can put in a stick of chewing gum that's a PCI Express NVMe drive that uses 4 PCI Express lanes. We're spoiled. Look how far we've come in 5 years. It still says it's booting, but I'm not seeing anything on the screen. And there's no guarantee this power supply that's working today is going to work tomorrow. Like I said, sometimes it would boot, sometimes it wouldn't. Now on the OCZ power supplies, well, first let me back up. In the old days, I'd say 10, 15 years or more, when a power supply didn't work, you would turn it on, turn it off, or it would just be off and you couldn't turn it on, nothing. With these OCZ power supplies, the fans would kick in high, and sometimes you would get a memory error in Windows 10 and the computer would just go poof and reboot. Very annoying, extremely annoying. In fact, one of the systems we built with a Ryzen, we used an old power supply, OCZ, changed out the power supply, all the memory problems were gone. All the problems we have with Windows 10 were gone. We were chasing ghosts. With another machine I had that I had just rebuilt, it was 4 months prior to getting our hands on the new Ryzen machine. So we rebuilt an AMD FX new motherboard. Everything was fine for about 3 months. Then all of a sudden it started going poof every once in a while. Again, crazy memory errors, which I knew had nothing to do with memory. Even though one was DDR3 and one was DDR4, changed out the power supply, problem solved. So, folks, a computer starts with a good foundation. Now, the heart of any computer is the chipset. You want to build a computer with a good chipset, but you got to have a good motherboard. But power is everything. If you don't have a good power supply, you're wasting your time. Now, this computer is still booting up. I just want to see it proof of concept to make sure it's working. Now, when I put in a new power supply, it's not going to boot any faster, but it should boot consistently every time we turn it on, and that's the key. And we should have seen something on the screen by now, and we have not. So, in the interest of time, I do know the computer is booting, but I didn't let it finish. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it off and put in a new power supply. So bear with me. I'll hit the power button, hold it down to make it turn off. By the way, it's not a good idea to do this repeatedly with Windows because eventually Windows will freak out. So the machine is off. I'm going to turn off power on the power tap. My light is off. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect power here. See, I've still got power coming in. I can hit the power button again to drain that out, which it did. I'll disconnect the monitor for now, so there's nothing attached. Now comes the work. So we've got one SATA, and on this motherboard where we have the 20+4, that's interesting. They've only got a 20 pin in here. I'm going to go ahead and use the full 24 pin on this motherboard and the 4 pin. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Wow. Nothing that requires the Molex. The fan on the back is powered from the motherboard. So I've got 3 places to plug in power with this power tap. The power supply, the main, 20+, the 4 pin, and then I've got one hard drive in here that'll take SATA. So this shouldn't take too long. And the connection to the hard drive, they've used a Molex to SATA power adapter. So I'm going to pull all that stuff out. We'll unclip the main power supply. We'll wiggle that out. We'll pull out the 4 pin. Wiggle that out. I got to tell you, this is one of the cleanest computers I've seen. But I also found out that Andrew has cleaned it. So no wonder it's so clean. Now I've got to have a screwdriver to get these 4 screws out. Okay, back with the screwdriver. Now I've got 2 Phillips screwdrivers, and while I'm at it, I'm going to show you. I've got a regular Phillips screwdriver, and I've got one that's extra long. The reason for the extra long one is when I'm building a new machine, I can get down inside a case and go straight without having to teeter-totter to reach those screws that mount to the motherboard. So I always keep that around handy when I'm building a machine. But the shorty will do right now for what I want. So I'm going to lay this down. The wiring harness is disconnected. And I've got 4 screws to remove. And this uses a Torx bit. So I've got the option of either a Torx or a straight blade, not a Phillips. So I'm going to have to opt for a straight, because everything I use with Torx goes with a screw gun. Don't want to use a screw gun when you're doing this. I like Torx bits, but not on a computer. If security is an issue, then I get it. Phillips will do me just fine. Now when I undo this 4th screw, there's a pin inside here that holds that power supply that may not fit. And when I get this out, I'm holding my hand against the power supply. I may have to reach in and release that pin. It's just a little tab that holds it in the little boot. I'm going to release it. That should pop loose, and it did. Now once I get this out, I'm going to hold the 2 power supplies side by side. Oh. One other power supply, that was also SATA. So we had 2 SATA devices, the burner and the hard drive. Okay, here's where we're going to look and compare. Now based on depth, they're exactly the same. Based on height, they're exactly the same. Side to side. Thickness is the same. It's amazing to me that we can get a more powerful power supply in the same physical size as the old one. They're more efficient. That was quite evident when we put in the last 750s, replacing the OCZ with the EVGA G3. They were smaller. I couldn't believe how much smaller. And they were lighter. More powerful, more efficient. So, we're going to put this in, the wiring harness out of the way. Slide that in very gently. Put this to the back. And there's a proper spot there where it should just sit in that little boot. And that clamp just hits it. So what I want to do is I'm going to secure the power supply before I hook up the devices, because I don't want that power supply getting loose and causing havoc. So, check my hole alignment. First one in. And it doesn't matter the order. whichever one you want to go for first. I've got 2 screws, and I'm not tightening them all. I'm just getting them started until I have all 4 of them in. But those 2 are set far enough that the power supply won't come loose. I've got 3. Now for number 4. 1 power supply, 4 screws in the back. Okay, first thing I'll do is I'm going for the motherboard. So I'm looking for the large 24 pin and the secondary that I had sorted out. Always check your power supply leads before you put one in to make sure you got what you need with the CPU. So the first one I'm going to put in will be the 24 pin. And this motherboard has a plug for 24 pin. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on. Make sure those 2 are connected. There we go. We have 24 pin power. 20 plus 4. Again, they only had 20 pin on there. We're putting 24. And we have these 2 together, a 4 and a 4. We're only going to use one of them. Doesn't matter which one. Check your orientation where the clamp's at. We'll get that one on. So now we have the 2 power taps, the 24 pin and the extra one for the CPU. And I'm going to wad all these cables up when I'm finished and try to make something look a little bit neater when I get to that point. Now, the next thing I've got is my 2 SATA devices, which is the burner on top and the hard drive. Now, I've got plenty of cables, so I'll use one for one direction, one the other. They're too far away to try to use them both on the same thing. And we've got plenty here, so that's not an issue. So I'm going to take one, bring it to the top, and you'll want to watch your power because it's got an orientation with one end like an L shape bent down, so you can't get it reversed. I'm watching the orientation of the cable so it'll have a natural lay of the land, so I'm not forcing anything. I can see it, but get it on there. Okay, and straight in we go. So now we have power to the burner on top. And that's got an easy flow to it. And I'll take the other and put it to the hard drive. Same thing. Check my orientation. Oh, that's a Molex. Oddly enough, we're not using a Molex. That's the PCI Express, would be for a video card. So here's our other PCI Express, excuse me, the SATA. PCI Express is over here and the Molex is over here. We won't use them, we'll just fold them up. I'm checking my orientation. Sometimes I feel like you've got to be a bit of a contortionist to get these things in. When we build a machine, I like a case that's got room to move in. And that's something to think about when you build one of those like a multimedia type PC. You get a case you can work in. Because if you're like the rest of us and you work on computers very much, you'll be upgrading little things like maybe the hard drive. Might upgrade the processor, but more likely could be memory over time. Those are pretty easy things to do. And a case that's easy to get into, you'll be glad you did later on. Takes a little more fun working on them. Because once you get the bug for working on computers, I tell you, I've been doing this for a long time and we get hooked. Builder Buy meets almost every Wednesday from 1 to 3. It's a live meeting. We're now streaming that meeting on social media, right now on YouTube. So if you get a chance, take a look. You can see some of the stuff we do. Sometimes we get a little long-winded, but we're trying to answer questions and trying to help one another. We learn by doing. So now I've got all these cables plugged in, I've got them bound, and I've got a natural progression where these cables fold. Now there were no cable ties included, but I'm going to use the ties that came with the power supply on the original wiring harness on the new power supply to tie this little bundle up and get it out of the way nice and neat. It's not a case with a window on it, so there's no room in this case to try to put that stuff somewhere else, but it's in a neat little bundle. It's out of the way. We're tied up. We have a new power supply in. So what we want to do now, double check ourselves. We had 4 connections. One to the motherboard, 24 pin, then we went from 20 to 24. Secondary to the CPU, which is a 4 pin. Then 2 devices. Both are SATA. One SATA to the burner on the front, and one SATA to the hard drive internal. And the cage in here has room for another hard drive if Andrew chose to do that. I don't think Andrew's going to do that. If he used another drive, it'd probably be external, and that'd be for cloning, imaging, and backup. And folks, if your data is important, clone, image, or backup, whichever you choose. Personally, I prefer Macrium Reflect right now. We used to use ESUS to do. Clone the drive, then once you cloned it, then be sure you either image it repeatedly or backup, whichever you prefer. But always have that on another drive. That way, if you're in a situation where the machine goes south, your data is intact. Everything's plugged in. I'm going to turn this around. We'll put the power back on to the case. So we're going to plug in power to the case. We're going to plug in video, and this time we're going to put in a keyboard and a mouse. And we're going to let it boot all the way up. And our cable came out of the monitor, so I've got to hook that back up. So that's going to take just a minute. And yes, this could be hooked to the monitor and screwed in so that it wouldn't come loose, but I don't typically use DVI connections on computers or VGA. Because of what we do with our equipment, I prefer HDMI. So that's all hooked back up. Now I'm going to get a keyboard and a mouse out. And we're going to hook that up. This is an older keyboard and mouse. This used to be a business pack that Microsoft put out. I wish they still put them out. They quit making this keyboard and mouse combination. Change for the sake of change. My motto is, build good, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I put a lot of these keyboard and mice out with computers over the years. If I'd have known, I'd have hung on to some of them. Because a lot of the keyboards and mice that are out now, I don't like. And yes, I know you can use the wireless, but when I'm working with a machine that I need to test, I need to make sure everything is the lowest common denominator. That being, it needs to be hooked up. Especially if I'm trying to diagnose problems on a computer. Keep it simple. It's always our motto, keep it simple. I'm going to turn power on from the power tap. We'll see a light on the back. Turn on the power supply. Power to the monitor. Oh, that's right, this one doesn't have an LED on it. What am I thinking? That one had an LED on the back. See how weird creatures of habit? What we're going to be looking at is I'm going to spin this around so we can look at the inside. And what we're going to see is what we typically see. Motherboard would have an LED on it. This one does. So we got power to the motherboard, which means the power is on the power supply. And if there's any doubt, there's a bar and the 0. So we press it toward the bar. Now we're going to power this on. We'll watch the lights and see what happens. Okay, got power to the keyboard. I saw it light up, and bingo. See how quick that came up? Ain't that a hoot? We've seen the BIOS, and now we're booting Windows. We were not getting enough power to the motherboard. We've put in a new power supply, and the power supply we put in is a 500 watt as opposed to what it had, which was a 350 watt. And we paid $10 less than what we could have bought this on Newegg for. This is a Bestec 350 watt, but due to the age of the computer, adequate was good enough for them. We put new life on this computer. Windows is coming up. The light's on, the system's booting. The system was trying to boot a while ago, and like I said, it was inconsistent. Sometimes it would boot, sometimes it wouldn't. But it's kind of like a router. If you can't get into it, in other words, when I was booting this computer, I never did see the BIOS screen. And I should have had a key sequence where I could have seen so I could have gotten into it. Or Windows, which I'm seeing now. But that was an indication to me we weren't getting enough power. So just like a router, if you can't get into a router, time to change the router. If you can't get into a computer by getting it to boot up correctly, motherboard's one option, power supply is another. And so power supply is an easy option. And since we couldn't change this out because it's the BTX style motherboard, we put in a new power supply. Voila. Andrew's computer is booting. And there we are. Welcome. It booted up faster this time than the last time I had it running. I've probably been around this computer, I would say maybe 6 or 8 times. and out of those 6 or 8 times, I've only been able to see windows come up twice. This is number 3 on the new power supply. So hope you enjoyed this little segment on changing a power supply out. And then again, this is on an HP 600. And what I'm going to do is bring up the Belarc report right quick. You can't fully see it on the screen. I could zoom in on it, but we don't have the switch set up to throw it on screen. So I'm just going to bring up the Belarc report and I'll tell you what's on here, because it's important enough to know. Anybody that's got a computer, I'd strongly encourage you to run Belarc Advisor. You can Google it, it's free. Download the Belarc Advisor, run it on your computer. It'll also run a report on your network. Let it do a couple of updates that are required, and it will tell you the brand, which this is an HP P6000, shows the serial number, the asset tag, tells me Windows 10 Home is on here, what build. We're under build version 1607. This was installed on 4/19/2016. BIOS date on this is 4/12/2010. So this is 2017. This machine has a BIOS date of 2010. Definitely got his money's worth. 7 years. And now he's got Windows 10 on here. So whether it's for the grandkids or whoever, as Andrew said, this was the computer. I said, Andrew, this was the first computer. So it's no longer just a doorstop, it's a working computer. So now when he builds his new computer, he'll have 2 computers he can network. But this little report tells us a lot of information. I like this to also tell me how the RAM is situated. In other words, I can tell by looking at it physically, but I run this report, and if I were going to upgrade RAM in this, it's got 2, 4, 6. It's got 4 slots, 2 gigs, and 3 slots, which is really odd. It's got 6 gigs of RAM. This is probably DDR2. I'd have to pull one and take a look at it. I could also take a look at the report from Kingston and Crucial, and they would give me details about this particular motherboard. But I can tell I can upgrade the RAM. So, based on the age of it, 2 more gigs of RAM would be a good place to be. 8 gigs of RAM would be great for this machine, and I think it would give it just a little bit of an edge. 6 gigs is kind of slim, but when you think about this being 7 years old, and it's a 64-bit processor. This is an AMD Athlon 2 X4 635. So it's 2.9 gigahertz. An AMD Athlon 2 X4 635. That's all in the report. But what I do when I work on a machine, I take this report, I copy it off, I give it a name specific to the user in the computer, and I put it on a thumb drive and keep it. So that if they say, you remember when you worked on my computer? Not. I can call up this report and I can tell them more than you want to know. But I know what I need to know. I also use this report as a little side note when I'm configuring a router. If I need to replace a router or do something special like reserve IP addresses, the 3 pieces of information are in this file that I need. They are the MAC address, the IP address, and the device name. And I can take those 3 pieces of information, set up a router, so when the user plugs it in, everything just works. And I'm an advocate of having your own router. I don't think you should let whoever your ISP is control your network. You are in control of your network. Remember that. So, hope you enjoyed this. Thanks to this little clip of Builder Buy, we've installed a power supply. And if you enjoyed this clip, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and do a like. And thanks for your support. Have a great day.